The Valley of Hungering Silence was a place wise men burned from their maps, a place where the earth itself had been poisoned into a canvas of dust and bone. Jedediah Cain wasn't a wise man. He was just a weary scout searching for a freshwater spring, his throat cracked with thirst. He expected to find sun-bleached cattle skulls and the ghosts of forgotten prospectors. He found her instead. An Apache girl, barely a woman, sitting beside a spring that had run dry as ash. Her ceremonial dress was impossibly white against the gray decay. When she met his gaze, her voice was a fragile whisper. "I have never been touched." Then, with trembling hands, she pulled back the soft deerskin on her wrist, revealing the ruinous secret branded into her skin, the mark of the Soul Eater. Every instinct screamed at Jedediah to run, to leave this cursed creature to her fate. But what he saw in her eyes wasn't a monster. It was a terrified girl, pleading for help. The choice wasn't about thirst anymore. It was about salvation, and it would cost him everything. He uncorked the canteen, the sound obscenely loud in the dead air. He watched the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cool, almost cold despite the punishing sun. He knelt, a silent agreement passing between them, a contract signed without a single spoken word. Her name, he learned, was Nalin. She spoke little, her words chosen with the care of a woman who had few to spare. As he helped her onto his weary horse, settling her in front of him, he could feel the brittleness of her bones through the thin deerskin. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a ghost of a girl who weighed no more than the secret she carried. He swung himself up behind her, his body a reluctant shield against the cruel world they now shared. He turned the horse not east, towards the distant promise of civilization, but north, into the tangled labyrinth of canyons he knew from a lifetime he was trying to forget. It was a fool's path, a path only a man with nothing left to lose would dare to take. For 2 days they moved through the canyons, the silence between them as vast and unforgiving as the landscape. Jedediah's mind, a place he usually kept locked and barred, became a gallery of ghosts. He saw the faces of the men from Black Creek, their eyes wide with surprise and betrayal as the world exploded around them. He felt the phantom weight of the rifle in his hands, the one he never fired, the one he'd dropped as he'd scrambled into the crevice that saved his life and damned his soul. His survival had been a fluke, a coward's luck. He'd spent the 5 years since wandering, drifting, a man convinced he was living on borrowed time, time that belonged to better men. Now, the quiet weight of the girl in front of him felt like a judgment. He was a fraud, a hollow man pretending to be a protector, and it was only a matter of time before she saw the truth of him. On the 3rd morning, the fever took her. It came on fast, a dry, consuming heat that left her delirious, her whispers a tangled mix of Apache words and frightened pleas. He laid her in the shade of an overhang, her skin burning to the touch. This, he thought with a bitter irony, was his punishment. He'd taken on the role of savior, only to watch her die of a common trail fever. But as he looked at her, at the intricate patterns of her white dress, something stirred in the dusty archives of his memory. He saw the face of an old Apache scout he'd once served with, a man named Gray Elk, who had spoken of the sacred plants, the secret remedies of his people. It was knowledge Jedediah had buried, part of the life he'd tried to excise from his soul. Now it was their only hope. He left Nalin by the rock face, his knife in hand, and began to search. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, his eyes scanning the unforgiving terrain not for threats, but for salvation. He found it, just as Gray Elk had described, clinging to the shaded side of a rock, a tough, spidery plant with small gray-green leaves. He crushed them between 2 stones, the air filling with a sharp, medicinal scent. When he returned to Nalin, she was mumbling, her eyes wide and unseeing. He mixed the paste with a few drops of their dwindling water and gently forced it between her lips. As he worked, a flicker of movement caught his eye. 3 men stood at the mouth of the narrow canyon, their figures silhouetted against the morning sun. They were not bandits. Their clothes were too plain, their faces too clean. They moved with the eerie, coordinated purpose of true believers. Each man held a rifle, not with the lazy confidence of a drifter, but with the rigid discipline of a soldier. One of them, a gaunt man with eyes that burned with a cold fire, raised his hand. "The corrupted vessel must be cleansed," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The prophet commands it." Jedediah felt a familiar, sickening chill. This was not a robbery. It was an execution. He laid Nalin down gently, his hand resting for a moment on her forehead. The fever was already starting to break. He rose, pulling the long, heavy blade from the sheath on his hip. He didn't draw his pistol. A gun was loud. A gun was a declaration. A knife was a secret. He faded back into the shadows of the canyon, a ghost returning to the world of the living. He moved without a sound, the lessons of a forgotten war coming back to him with brutal, intimate clarity. The first man died without ever seeing him, a hand over his mouth, the steel a cold, efficient whisper in his throat. The second turned, his eyes widening in surprise for a fraction of a second, before Jedediah's knife found the soft space beneath his ribs. The third, the gaunt leader, managed to fire off a single panicked shot that ricocheted wildly off the canyon wall. Jedediah closed the distance in 2 silent strides, the man's righteous fury dissolving into a gurgling plea as his lifeblood soaked the thirsty ground. It was over in less than a minute. In the pocket of the leader, he found not a gold watch or a pouch of coin, but a small, cheaply printed devotional pamphlet, its cover adorned with the image of a single all-seeing eye. The New Dawn, it was called. This was not the end of their trouble. It was just the beginning. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat. The devotional pamphlet was flimsy in Jedediah's hands, its cheap paper a stark contrast to the grim reality of the 3 bodies cooling in the dust. The symbol of the eye was printed on its cover, a single unblinking sentinel that promised revelation, but delivered only death. He tucked it into his pocket, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Nalin was awake when he returned, her fever broken, her eyes clear and watchful. She saw the fresh blood on his buckskin shirt, but said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The scent of violence hung in the air, a metallic tang that overpowered the dust and sage. For a week, they pushed north, navigating a maze of forgotten trails Jedediah pulled from the locked rooms of his memory. He felt a grim satisfaction in the act, the flexing of a muscle he'd allowed to atrophy. He taught her how to find water, how to read the subtle language of the land. In return, she taught him silence, not the empty, hollow silence of his self-imposed exile, but a living silence, one filled with the rustle of a lizard on a hot rock, the distant cry of a hawk, the rhythm of their own breathing. He found himself watching her, not as a burden or a curse, but as a person. He saw the quiet resilience in her hands, the flicker of a smile when he managed to snare a rabbit for their dinner, the profound sadness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. They found the town of redemption clinging to the side of a mountain, a collection of weather-beaten shacks that had long since surrendered to the wind and the dust. It was a ghost town, a place of broken dreams and forgotten prospectors, and for them, it was a sanctuary. They took shelter in the old Assayer's office, its roof miraculously intact. For the first time in weeks, they had 4 solid walls and a door that could be barred. Jedediah felt a strange, unfamiliar peace settle over him as he watched Nalin meticulously sweep the floor with a makeshift broom. It was the illusion of a home, a fleeting glimpse of a life he thought he'd forfeited forever. The illusion was shattered the next afternoon. A man rode into town, his black coat a stark slash against the muted browns of the landscape. He was tall, his face a mask of serene certainty. He rode not with the weary slump of a traveler, but with the ramrod posture of a man who believed the world was his pulpit. It was the preacher, Marcus Thorne. He stopped his horse in the middle of the street, his eyes locking onto the assayer's office as if he'd been given a divine map. He did not draw a weapon. He simply waited. Jedediah watched from the grimy window, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Thorne's followers, a dozen silent men, filtered into the town, taking up positions with a quiet, disciplined menace. Thorne dismounted and approached the office, his footsteps the only sound in the dead town. "Jedediah Kane," he called, his voice not a shout but a calm, reasonable invitation. "A man of your reputation should know when a fight is already lost. I am not here for you. I am here for the girl." Tight, Jedediah opened the door, stepping out onto the broken boardwalk, his body a shield in front of the doorway where Nalin stood. "She's not for sale, preacher." Thorn smiled, a thin, pitying expression. "Sale? My dear man, you misunderstand. I am not a merchant. I am a savior. That mark on her wrist, the one you think is a curse, it is a sign of her sacred bloodline. My people, we are dying, a wasting sickness, a plague of the spirit that leaves our children weak and our women barren. The mark is a map, a key to a cure her people have hoarded for generations." Nalin stepped out from behind Jedediah, her voice clear and strong. "He is lying. The brand is not a map. The story of the Soul Eater is a shield, a lie we tell to protect ourselves from men like you. My touch, it can heal. But the gift is not a cure to be bottled and sold. It is a balancing. It takes a life to give a life." Thorn's mask of serene piety slipped, his eyes flashing with a desperate predatory hunger. "Then the price will be paid. Jedediah, I will give you $1,000 in gold for her, enough to start over, to build a life, to forget whatever ghosts haunt you." He gestured to two of his men, who opened a saddlebag filled with the dull gleam of coins. The offer hung in the air, heavy and obscene. Jedediah looked at Nalin, at the defiant terror in her eyes, and then back at the gold. He thought of the faces at Black Creek, of the years he'd spent running from a single moment of fear. He felt the cold weight of that cowardice, a sickness in his own soul. He looked at Thorn, and for the first time in 5 years, his voice held no trace of apathy. "Get off my land!" The rejection hung in the air, a declaration of war. Thorn's serene mask dissolved completely, revealing the fanatic beneath. His voice, once a calm invitation, now cracked like a whip. "You choose a cursed savage over your own kind? So be it." But he did not order an attack. He smiled, a truly cruel and knowing smile. "Redemption," he boomed, his voice echoing off the silent buildings. "Your town lives up to its name today, for I have brought you a sinner seeking it." He pointed a long, accusatory finger at Jedediah. "This man is not a simple drifter. He is Jedediah Kane, the coward of Black Creek, the scout who hid in a hole while his comrades were butchered." The townsfolk, who had been watching from their windows, now crept out onto the street, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A hulking miner, with a face like a slab of raw meat, spat on the ground. "I had a brother at Black Creek." The words were a death sentence. The atmosphere in the town shifted, the unspoken code of the frontier turning against Jedediah with a brutal, instantaneous verdict. He was no longer a stranger, he was a pariah, a man whose cowardice was a stain on their collective honor. Jedediah saw the hatred in their eyes, the cold, righteous fury of men who saw him as less than a man. He grabbed Nalin's arm, pulling her back inside the office as the first rock clanged off the wooden door. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to fill with the bruised purple-gray clouds of an approaching blizzard. The hunt had begun, and the world itself had turned against them. He barred the door, the shouts of the mob a rising tide of fury. All hope was gone, buried beneath the weight of his past. He had run from his ghosts for 5 years, and they had finally found him in a dead town at the end of the world. He slid down the door, the cold wood at his back, and stared at his own trembling hands. He had a scratch on his palm from the morning's chase. As he watched, a single drop of blood welled up. Nalin knelt before him, her face a mask of quiet resolve. She took his hand in hers, her touch impossibly gentle. A faint golden light, warm and soft, emanated from her palm. He watched, stunned, as the scratch on his hand sealed itself, the skin knitting together, leaving no scar. It was a miracle, a silent testament of faith in a man who had none left in himself. The storm howled outside, a chorus of wind and rage, but inside the small, dark office there was a single defiant glimmer of hope. The blizzard raged, a screaming wall of white that sealed them in the mountain's gut. In the heart of the storm, their small cave was a pocket of impossible stillness. Jedediah stared at his own hand, at the palm where a bleeding cut had been only moments before. Now there was only smooth, unbroken skin. The memory of Nalin's touch, of that soft, warm light, felt more real than the stone beneath him. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fool's currency, but it was all he had left. "The brand," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Thorn called it a map." Nalin looked up from the small sputtering fire, her eyes deep and ancient. "It is not a map to a place, Jedediah, not to a village hidden in a canyon. My people do not hide from the world. We are woven into it. The brand does not show the way home. It shows the way to the spirits." She traced the intricate lines on her wrist with a fingertip. "It shows the path to the high places, the sacred ground where the earth touches the sky. That is where we go when the world becomes too loud. The way to the sky." The phrase snagged on a hook in Jedediah's memory, a memory he'd spent 5 years trying to bury. He fumbled in his saddlebag, his fingers closing around a roll of oilskin. He spread it on the ground, an old hand-drawn scouting map, its creases worn soft as cloth. He traced the brand on Nalin's wrist, memorizing the pattern of swirls and lines, then turned to his map. His fingers, stained with dirt and blood, moved over the faded ink. It wasn't a path. It was a constellation of landmarks, a split rock here, a trio of ancient pines there, a dry riverbed that curved like a serpent. His eyes followed the invisible lines they created, and his breath caught in his throat. They all pointed to one location, a high, windswept mesa with sheer cliffs on 3 sides, accessible by a single treacherous trail. The army had called it the Eagle's Perch. It was the last place on earth he ever wanted to see again. It was the site of his final training exercise, a place whose every rock and crevice had been seared into his brain, and it was less than a mile from Black Creek. The shame hit him like a physical blow, the old wound tearing open. He'd survived that massacre because he knew the one flaw in the canyon's defenses, the one crevice the attackers had missed. He had called it cowardice, he had called it a curse. But as he looked at Nalin, at the impossible, defiant hope in her eyes, he saw it for what it truly was. It was not a curse, it was preparation. Every mile he had scouted, every trail he had memorized, every moment of his shameful survival, it had all led him to this cave, to this girl, to this one final purpose. "I thought I survived because I was a coward who ran," he thought, the realization a silent thunderclap in his soul. "But now I know I survived, so I could be the one man who would stand and fight for her." He looked at Nalin, his voice steady and clear for the first time. "I know the place," he said, "and I know how to use it. Thorn thinks he is the hunter. It's time we reminded him what it feels like to be the prey." They moved at the heart of the storm, the blizzard their cloak. Jedediah was no longer a drifter. He was an instrument of the landscape itself. He used the wind to cover their tracks and the blinding snow to mask their movements. He led Thorn's men into a narrow box canyon where he'd set a tripwire, sending a cascade of heavy rocks and snow down upon them. 3 men were buried without a sound. He guided them over a frozen scree slope, its surface weakened by a channel he'd dug hours before. 2 more of the prophet's disciples tumbled into the chasm below, their righteous screams swallowed by the storm. He was a ghost, a phantom of the mountain, turning the hunter's relentless pursuit into a death march. The final confrontation took place at the summit of the Eagle's Perch as the blizzard began to break. Thorn and his last 4 men found Jedediah and Nalin waiting for them on the sacred ground, a flat, open mesa surrounded by a sheer 1,000-foot drop. Thorn's face was a mask of fury, his serene piety burned away by the cold and the loss of his men. "The Lord has delivered you to me, blasphemer," he roared. "It wasn't the Lord who led you here, preacher," Jedediah said, his voice calm, his pistol steady in his hand. "It was me." The fight was not a battle. It was a harvest. Jedediah had used the morning to prepare the ground, and now he reaped the rewards. A length of rope sent one man toppling over the edge. A patch of slick ice, carefully concealed beneath a dusting of snow, took another. The final 2 fell to Jedediah's cold, efficient marksmanship. He was a man remade, his actions precise and devoid of rage. This was not vengeance. It was a balancing of the scales. Thorn stood alone, his fanaticism finally broken, his eyes wide with the terrified realization that his God had abandoned him. Jedediah walked towards him, his face grim. He did not kill the preacher. He simply took his gun, his horse, and his winter coat. The mountain will judge you now, Jedediah said, turning his back and walking away, leaving Thorn to the mercy of the wind and the cold. They found Nolan's village nestled in a hidden valley 2 days later, a place of impossible green in a world of red rock. The reunion was a quiet, solemn affair, a river of unshed tears and gentle, knowing hands. Jedediah stood at a distance, an outsider who had delivered their lost child home. He intended to leave that morning, to disappear back into the wilderness. His purpose served. But Nolan's father, a wise old man with eyes that saw the soul, placed a hand on his shoulder. "A man who brings a hawk back to the nest has a place here," he said. "Stay. Teach us what you know." Spring had come to the valley. The snows had melted, and the creeks ran full and fast. Jedediah Kane was still there. He had not left. In the mornings, he took the young warriors into the high country, teaching them the subtle art of tracking, the silent language of the scout, the knowledge he had once considered a curse. In the afternoons, he worked with the men, felling timber, shaping the logs with a skill he didn't know he possessed. Together, they were building a watchtower on the ridge overlooking the valley's entrance, a permanent sentinel against the dangers of the outside world. He stood on the unfinished platform, the clean scent of pine, sharp in the cool air, and looked out at the valley, at the smoke rising from the lodges, at the children laughing by the creek, at Nolan tending to her garden. He was not a drifter. He was not a coward. He was a guardian. He was home.